So my name is David Cooper, and for the purposes of a visual description, I am a white man with glasses, some facial hair, and as my daughter is keen to point out, increasingly greying hair as well. And I'm a senior lecturer within the Department of English at Manchester Metropolitan University, where I'm also the founding co-director of the Centre for Place Writing, a research and knowledge exchange centre that brings together creative writers and literary critics with shared interests in place and its many meanings. The members of the centre are involved in a wide range of projects, many of which involve collaborating with colleagues in other disciplines and working in partnership with a wide range of communities, both in the city, Manchester, and well beyond. Teaching is also really fundamental to the life of the centre. We have the pleasure of working with students right from first year undergraduates working on place to PhD researchers and beyond. And when we had officially launched the centre a few years ago, we had two ambitions, which I just wanted to mention at the start of this evening's event and celebration. First, we voiced our passionate belief that PhD researchers needed to be at the heart of what we were doing as a centre, as it is their innovations which will expand our understanding of the complex relationship between writing, and I think particularly creative non-fictional writing, but not only, and place. It's incredibly exciting then that we now have around 15 postgraduate researchers working on place-based topics within the Department of English and the Centre for Place Writing. Second, in an essay which my colleague Rachel Lichtenstein and I published on the university website a couple of years ago, we acknowledged the historic and deeply problematic lack of diversity in the broadly defined field of place writing. We articulated the centre's commitment to changing the cultural landscape of this field through our public engagement activities, workshops, projects, and crucially teaching. Given these twin ambitions then, it gives me enormous pleasure to be able to introduce and host this evening's event, a celebration, to use that word again, of a landmark collection that has been curated by one of our own postgraduate researchers, Louise Kenwood, and collection in Louise's own words seeks to expand and develop the increasingly popular field of nature writing to highlight the marginalised voices of those who live with chronic illness and disability. It is equally wonderful that in addition to Louise, we've been joined by three of the contributors to the collection, Kat Chong, Khairani Barokka, and Sally Huband. If it's okay, I just want to explain a little bit about the format of this evening's event. So we will begin with Louise, who will talk about the genesis of the collection and the process through which it has been brought into the world by Footnote Press. We'll then hand over to Kat, who will read from their contribution to the book. And after that, we can have a little break for 5 minutes. So we'll have a 5 minutes of a break after Kat's reading. Then after the break, we're going to have further readings from Okka and Sally. And then the event will end with questions. So as we go through, please do put any questions that you've got in the chat, any thoughts or any observations, do please put them on the chat. I've read the book and I've got, as I was just saying before we started, I've got pages and pages of scribbled notes. So I've got lots of questions that I'd like to ask everyone, but it'd be great if I'd rather give people the opportunity to ask questions. So please do put them in the chat, and Martin is going to sort of keep an eye on them and then feed them through to me at the end of the event. And we're going to aim to finish probably around sort of 7:45 rather than 8. See how we get on with the timings. And finally, actually, one thing I should have said as well, when mentioning Martin, who's going to keep on the chat, this event is being held in sort of partnership between the Centre for Place Writing at Manchester Met and the Manchester Poetry Library, which is also at the university, which is the first public poetry library in the northwest of England, which works locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally with the widest range of people to create a place where language is celebrated in all its diversity. So yeah, thank you to the Poetry Library for sort of working with us on this, and thank you for Martin for keeping an eye on the chat. So that's the sort of introduction and sort of a map, if you like, of where we are this evening. So I want to begin with introducing Louise, who, like I say, I've got the great pleasure of working with at Manchester Met. And Louise Kenwood is a writer, artist, and psychologist. Working for the NHS for much of her career, she set up CyberPsych in 2020 with the aim of raising awareness and understanding of energy-limiting chronic illness. Her writing has been published widely and is included in such publications as Women on Nature, But You Don't Look Sick, The Clearing, The BMJ, The Polyphony, The Unwritten, and The Bookseller. In 2020, she co-produced Disturbing the Body, and her essay, The Ocean as Mirror, was commissioned for BBC Three's Landscapes for Recovery series, and that was broadcast last year. Between 2021 and 2022, Louise was a writer in residence with Sussex Wildlife Trust. Currently undertaking a practice-led PhD with the Centre for Place Writing, Louise's research explores post-viral illness through the landscape of Romney marshes. She's now preparing her first full-length book, A Trail of Breadcrumbs. So yeah, thank you, Louise, and yeah, I'll mute and hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. And thank you also to Martin and the Poetry Library for having us this evening. So I'm Louise, and for the purposes of a visual description, I'm a white woman with short, dark blonde hair, wearing dark rimmed glasses and a navy roll neck jumper with coloured zigzags and diamonds around the neck, with a dark green background and my nan's old mirrors hanging up behind me. And I'm so pleased to be joining you on our publication day. I'm especially pleased to be celebrating with the Manchester Poetry Library and Centre for Place Writing. And the Poetry Library is one of the few organisations who are continuing to run online events and who recently published a guide on accessibility earlier in the year. So I wanted to mention that and thank you all for your work on this. Ongoing online access and inclusion of disabled authors and readers, those who are continuing to shield or risk being further disabled by COVID and people living with energy limiting conditions, unable to access the outside world, is so important. And this book would not exist if I had not got the online access that was afforded us during lockdowns. Researching and connecting with contributors has relied almost entirely on social media and Zoom. So in introducing this anthology, I wanted also to share a little bit about what led me to this point and my own history of illness and connection with the natural world and place. So in 2011, I became seriously ill for the first time. Housebound and bedbound for months, it took 2 years to come anywhere close to a recovery. So once I was well enough, I travelled, taking the train and travelling slowly through Europe and Southeast Asia, Australia and Canada. And I wasn't entirely recovered, but my health had improved enormously. But then a year or so after returning to the UK, it began to decline again rapidly. And I was confronted with an ongoingness of illness that didn't respond as it had before, and that I had no real framework of understanding for. So I began to develop an arts practice before that first period of illness that was exploring neglected and abandoned spaces, derelict places. And I found myself drawing out huge mind maps on long rolls of wallpaper, rolls of lining paper across the floor of my home, trying to make sense of what was happening to my body and noticing the overlaps of themes with the art practice of these in-between places. Illness and place became entwined for me, and it's taken me several years since to begin to understand how and what that means. It's led to my PhD with David, but has also led me to connecting with poets and writers who explore the body and life in between illness and wellness. As Susan Sontag wrote at the beginning of Illness as Metaphor, we are all born with dual citizenship, holding 2 passports, to the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. And at some point, we will all check in to that less desirable second passport and enter the kingdom of the sick. I'm not sure which place I live in currently. I live in both, I live in neither, as many people with chronic illness do. It's both and neither, so it needs a different kind of knowledge and throws up a rich experience of material. And at the start of the anthology, I reference Virginia Woolf's essay on being ill, which I quote at the start. And she writes about the undiscovered countries that are disclosed during periods of illness, returning me again to themes of place. So there's been a huge growth in writing about place and about the natural world in the last decade or so. And I was really struck, as many others had been, how little people who are disabled or physically ill are considered in this area, which has long valued the endurance and the ability of predominantly the lone enraptured male, the middle-class, middle-aged, white, able-bodied man. And as Polly Atkin writes, there's nothing wrong with these tales from the lone enraptured males. The problem only comes when they're the only voices we hear. And there is so often a sense that these are singular people doing singular things. And yet we're not discrete entities, nor self-contained. Our leaky bodies breathe in the world around us and expel life from us back into that same world. We are all connected and connected inextricably with the world around us. So if we've learned nothing from the pandemic, it is that we are all connected. We breathe the same air, drink the same water. Eventually, everyone will be impacted by polluted rivers and rising sea levels, if we haven't already. If only we listened to those impacted first, those who know, if only we valued this knowledge, how different things could be. And this book's life started at the book launch of another anthology I worked on nearly 3 years ago. And I was asked at the end of the launch what my next project was. And I heard myself say for the first time, a book of nature writing by disabled authors and people who live with chronic illness. So since then, this project has grown and evolved and has become this beautiful book. At the end of 2021, I was awarded an Arts Council England grant, which enabled me to commission contributors and to run a series of workshops. And we had more than 1,000 writers join us for those online writing sessions. So these ran as I was gathering the work of the writers and artists who had generously agreed to be involved and share their stories. At the end of the project, Caro Clark set up a new literary agency and signed me up, finding the brilliant publisher in Footnote for its home. So for so much to happen behind the scenes, it's incredible to at last be able to share the work and talk to people involved. This is the second of 3 online events this week, with a third planned tomorrow evening with Sam Reed Bookshop, tomorrow night with Polly Atkin, Carol Donaldson and Louisa Ajoa Parker. And I think Martin's going to put the link in the chat for anyone who wants to join us to listen to new authors and to celebrate with us in Cumbria. So each event draws out a different theme in the collection. There are so many conversations between and within the pieces as poetry, prose, essays and drawings are grouped into loose sections on elements of the landscape. I'm also delighted to be able to include work that draws together an international group of writers, including Eli Clare, Kat Chong and Khairani Barokka, as well as across England and Scotland, including Sally and Shetland. Returning to thoughts on place writing and to my own particular interests, considering Sontag's quote on passports, there is also a different time zone we live in and language to learn when you live with chronic illness or disability. So I think place writing and landscape fits really well with these themes, especially as much of our engagement with the outdoors might be at a slow pace or in a small geographic area. We notice things differently, have a different perception and experience of the outdoors in this way. And I think Moving Mountains demonstrates that really well. So the anthology explores themes from the micro to the macro and back again, from a drop of rain to the north wind and a single quince fruit to the Indonesian rainforest. It brings together experiences of collecting and gathering, beachcombing and finding things on walks, relating them to the failings of our bodies and medicine, to foraging with friends and connecting with witchcraft and those who have been shunned and persecuted in generations past. Places encountered in this collection we'll be hearing from this evening include explorations of the coast and things found on the beach in Shetland, the indigenous rainforests of Indonesia and the influence of colonialism, and observations overlooking a military base in Singapore while in lockdown. And in my own writing of the introduction, I draw on my travels and time spent in Canada, which connects to the title of the book. And I reflect on how my experience of sustained illness has influenced and led to my writing and has developed my experience of place. So to finish up, I shall read a short piece from the introduction before handing back to David and having the chance to hear from Kat, Okka and Sally. So reading a short piece towards the end of the introduction. At a time when the world around us is showing us that it is sick and at risk, the voices of people who live similarly with risk and vulnerability are able to offer different narratives and new knowledge to those who do not have to regard or question their own bodies in the same way. My hope for this anthology is that it will open up new worlds and connections across landscapes and experience, offering perspectives that invite the reader to look again at the world around them. A kaleidoscope sits within these pages. This anthology offers a rich world of wild experience. Each contribution is filled with wisdom and vulnerability, insights and fears, losses and treasures. The experience of illness and disability provides a particular lens through which to view the world, but not the same lens for all. For there are as many interpretations of the more than human as there are humans from which to perceive it. Each essay and poem in these pages speaks to the uniqueness of the author's experience, while also carrying elements of universality in their explorations of loss and grief, joy and celebration. Indeed, it may be that it is precisely because we are living in bodies that remind us of our own vulnerabilities, of decay and mutability, that identifying with and experiencing the more than human can be all the more significant. Thank you. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was brilliant. I noticed in the chat, people saying there was some problems sort of logging in. So yeah, I'm sort of sorry if there was sort of there were technical difficulties. I'm not entirely sure why that was, but yeah, apologies if you did have difficulty logging in. Just to say, the whole session has been recorded, so you missed the first sort of the introduction, but we will make that available online yeah, after the events, so yeah, you'll be able to hear that introduction. I just wanted to say, if you did sort of log in late, I was just saying before that at the end of the session there'll be sort of time for questions, so if you've got any questions that you want to ask anyone, or any comments, please do put them in the chat, and my colleague Martin's going to be keeping an eye on that chat as we go through. So yeah, please do sort of, yeah, keep on adding to that, or if you just got any sort of comments or observations. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to introduce Kat Chong, who's a poet, published PhD student at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and visiting PhD fellow at the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham. They're a graduate of the Poetic Practice MA at Royal Holloway, co-founder of the Crested Tick Collective, and digital editor at Osmosis Press. Their work has been published internationally by presses such as Bad Betty, Flint, Ache, Permeable Barrier, Singapore Unbound, Experiment O, The Polyphony, and Ethos Books. Their most recent publications include the pamphlets Plain Air and Apology in Transit, I'm Writing My Own Way Out, and This is a Place of Refuge, a chapter in Not Without Us, Perspectives on Disability and Inclusivity in Singapore, as well as installations such as The Kindness Connection, which was commissioned by Singapore General Hospital. Their debut collection, 712 stanza Homes for the Sun, was published by Broken Sleep Books in April. Yeah, thank you very much for being here, Kat.
Thank you for having me. For the visual description, I am a non-binary mixed race person in a black hoodie with very short hair in front of a grey background. I'm going to read an extract from 712 stanza Homes for the Sun, which is a sequence on the multifaceted kind of connectedness between the body and the environment in the context of Singapore's academic landscape on the campus of NTU. I found so many institutional encounters amongst all the small interactions that we had with the land, and picking them apart kind of became the project for this piece. I also wanted to say thank you again to Louise and to the Manchester Poetry Library for hosting this evening. It's wonderful to be with you all. 398. I live between 14 military bases. In so much pain, the bombs would weep pumpkin pip seed messages, noting time, the pip boy counting units of radiation, the radar, a nautical investigation. The commons are here at the beginnings of water. I'll be right back. I'm just going to get a black pen. The root word for blacken is the same word for bleach, bleak, and total whiteness. To some of our most sacred texts, genre doesn't really apply. When I write, says Mary Ruefle in Madness, Rack and Honey, my gender becomes genre. To some of our most sacred texts, gender doesn't really apply, swerves off the radar out of algorithmic fidelity. To be untraceably genred, untrackably gendered, is to live untargetably as things. Like mirrors are blackened and bleached, so absorption voids the image. This is still an archive, and looking for a place to hide. Perhaps I should not be writing at all, a poetics of hips that knows how long I have left to plant or search for soil, a kinship to acknowledge the land and the possibility for grounding, whether it will emerge or look back, in laughter or cold water. I have no interest in weapons or their complicity. I am love hungry. I want to reply to you once I understand where the light is coming from. Blur with me. I failed the song of living. Blue with me. I finished that song, and the next day my brother died, said Peter Gizzi on day 395, the 29th of January 2021. On the 1st of February, Lisa Robertson's Instagram answers back in an image of 26 theses on crafts. She writes, 24, there is always something to do. 25, blank. 26, craft against death. 400. I've been keeping count of the days since the 1st of January 2020, counting the multiple precarities of the vulnerable, waiting to be allowed to see my family, my partner, my friends. The list gets longer each time. I can still hear the bombs, the military jets, the live firing from the Ponyan gun range that's under a mile away, or the Pasir Bar range that's a mile and a half away. And because I cannot tell the sound from which, and because a National Service Training Institute marks a perimeter just beyond the storm drain along the northwestern perimeter of the campus, and an SAF Singapore Air Force Base borders the south, and because the military holds all the land west on every blank map, perhaps regardless whether it's the record or the countdown, the dread is still the same. Perhaps this is still anecdotal, an unsubstantiated structure of belief with which to convey the unverifiable, the legal, institutional, empirical subterfuge. Jurong Island is just over 4 miles south. Shell, Chevron, BP, ExxonMobil, the Petrochemical Corporation of Singapore, and many more occupy the reclaimed artificial land. Taxi drivers tell me it's used for toxic chemical manufacturing, but that's just the rumor, the eavesdrop, the goss. The tone is still the same. Jurong Island, chronic pain, military prosperity, invisible disability. Believe me, please. The scent of burnt cocoa, the Cadbury's chocolate factory, ADM cocoa, Kongguan biscuit factory, and the poultry farms in Sungai Tengah all hang in the air at night. 433. This is somewhere. I feel too sick to speak. Perhaps pain is another reverberation. Does it come as an empire, rhetorical and investigatory, phenomenologically registered in the utterance? Can you tell from the way I speak? You will happen. An agreement between the poem and I, this rejoining. I'm misquoting Heraclitus to say enlightening is the Lord of everything. Pain is an inculcation. We live in mobile time. I can't spend the truth of my being and of being in love, the feeling of the ocean once and for all. My gender is as queer as my sickness. The locus plays out in comportment, coming into visibility and discoverable, a genre trouble. Stand out to me. Open the grave of your eyes. I do not ask for the moon or inconsolable sleep and affair without questions mine, faultlessly. Premonitions of the sacred about weapons and complicity in wellness, which is all the rage. To keep the pharmacy in the language of the front line, made paramilitary healing, attach care by keeping it under watch, survey what is bought and deemed safe enough to keep inside. This poem is for you, even if we don't survive. There is no recourse for the things they do to us, the data we have left. This pain is 4 mothers deep. I take another painkiller and there is nothing left to forgive in the countryside of my fear. How can we be together outside representation? The doctors note an obsolete genre. We will never detoxify. Painkillers are not sheer ascension. Reduced to the formal, I am more paperwork than I am more than my papers, says Divya Victor. On day 532, a macaque monkey enters the living room, refuses food, urinates on the floor, takes a black reel of Polaroid film and rips the wires from the fairy lights. We know they were there by what they have scattered. 553. The encounter's there as long as you look for radiant and radical proximity. Another monkey enters through the apartment window and all the raisins are gone. Indeed is an affirmation and an employment site, enough to know longing the shape of a decade. On such days, the revolution remains a commitment to narrative that turns on a collective force. Read all my politics, hear the autobiography of a face. No amount of poetry will ever amount to a diagnosis. How can we imagine the future for us? crip queer communities, a vocabulary capable of transmission to anyone outside this indefatigable kingdom, surround me. This lyric indulgence desire, rather in pain exploitation, has set the ocean on fire. You know what I'm going through, where I am, the names where it all takes place. I want to hold myself even unto death. The still struggling pronoun delusion needs an architect, says Lisa Robinson on day 553. The mysterious possible, a pronomial moonlight reflection unfolding, pain, a unit of attention, a common velocity, imminent and uncertain, but here, I'll call it writing. 580. The noumenon is calculated as limits bound the truth. No creases, corners, or rift geologized. Perhaps I ask too much of the scale when economies of law and neoliberal capital require the index to be unrepresentative. The entitled security when we couldn't tell what was cake and what wasn't, won't scan a body over the screen, a compression of signs or their names on which may still perish, bite me. An inability or severance from painkillers, medication, feeling for whichever love coexists, could write all poetry left in the world and to death be no more grievable. Don't accustom. Death warms the ground, the earth is hot with us in it, sleep poached. Today it woke me sleepless, for sure, for show. Alphabetum, Milo chocolate factory, biscuit factory in the air. The past is self-taking. The moneyed landslip between migrant, immigrant, our enemies have aged as well. Those ripe wrists, the thickets breathe back to life, lachrymose, lionized comeuppance and green grocery. The troposphere, it was all still a version of happiness. The lexicon of the age, it announced us as small fragments of larger crises. We are made of fresh blood, throwing hands under the air, negative dimensions of joy and jubilant light. 615. This number will last. Instant heaven, pheasant dreams, please stay with me. I get to myself by looking away at the edge of the evening. This is it. The number last of wild wraith thought, the extent of loss. There are ghosts that engender one's soul. On day 616, I see a wild boar outside the fields of campus where the stray dogs roam. There's vicarious freedom in seeing the sky on my phone from under my face, as though I might still get away with it. Dreams of summer, like mountains, the process of approach, all these badly written moments, the contingent possibility of restarting an impossible invitation that has never been made. Cut me loose. The scar above my heart is the constriction of genre. Gender is genre's body double. Reach across the construct, the lightning upstages. The ants congregate about my hairband. Is it impossible to engage with simplicity or non-complicity? Check the record. Accept this immaterial art. Desire across another page of water. There'll be no change in anything. Whatever this is, we waste together. The newest disaster that seems to connect yesterday to today. As abundance speaks to brevity, to never expect force to make room. This babel babble that makes violence more visible. It doesn't matter if we made it up the steps. Look at these haunted girl bones that translate jury into private sorrow. The difference between seeing and knowing is a mile away. On day 618, Sarah Fletcher's tweet quotes Rebecca Buxton's link to Judith Scar's review of Elaine Scarry's The Body in Pain. Pain, Scar writes, isn't a subject that has to be left entirely to biology. On the contrary, like torture and political oppression, pain is everybody's business. If you've understood this, throw it away. If you can't understand this, throw it away. I still insist on your freedom. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kat. That was such such brilliant reading. So thank you. Yeah, just sort of again keeping an eye on the chat, as I think Louise said at the beginning. This is sort of it's almost like a week-long celebration of the collection, and there's another event on tomorrow night. And Will and Polly have kindly put in the chat a link to the Zoom meeting for tomorrow night at Sam Reed. So yeah, if you want to sort of log in for more tomorrow night, and as like Louise said, each event I think will have sort of a slightly different spin, if you like. So as I said right at the beginning, and apologies again for those of you who couldn't get in, but as I said at the beginning, we were going to have a little break, a 5-minute break, before we then have some more readings after the break from Okka and Sally. So it's 4 minutes past 7 now, so we'll aim to start again at 10 past. Yeah, and then I'll introduce sort of the readers for the second half. So thank you, and I'll see you again in 5 minutes. Okay, hello again, everyone, and welcome back. So, in the second part of this launch event, it's my pleasure to introduce Khairani Barokka, who is a writer and artist from Jakarta and based in London. Okka's work has been presented widely internationally and aims to centre disability justice as anti-colonial praxis. Among her many accolades, she was a UNFPA Indonesian Young Leader Driving Change, an NYU Tisch Departmental Fellow, and an associate artist at the National Centre for Writing. And she was shortlisted for the 2023 Asian Women of Achievement Awards. Okka was co-editor of Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back for Nine Arches Press in 2017. Her first book, Indigenous Species, was published in 2016, followed by Rope in the following year. And she was shortlisted for the Barbellion Prize with Ultimatum Orangutan, also from Nine Arches, in 2021. She has two books forthcoming in 2024. So yeah, thank you very much for being here, Okka.
Thank you so much, David, for having me. Thank you, everyone in the audience. And thank you, Kat, for that beautiful, incredible reading. And I'm looking forward to Sally's as well. For an image description, I'm an Indonesian woman with shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a black dress with buttons, and my background, a virtual background, is behind me of grasses. So for all you know, I could be as small as an ant. You don't know my height. I'm going to read from my essay in this wonderful anthology, Moving Mountains, entitled The Clock Tower and the Canopy. And it's actually kind of an elaboration on a poem from my book, Ultimatum Orangutan, or Ultimatum Orangutan. It's a bilingual title in English and Indonesian. And that poem was entitled Time Machine. And I wrote it when I was an inpatient at the Input Pain Management Program at St. Thomas's Lodge brain fog. I have, okay, at Simon Lodge, St. Thomas's Hospital. There you go. And I wrote it when I was having to spend weekdays in the hospital looking across directly at the Big Ben. And you can tell I'm I'm a migrant because I say the Big Ben. And I would just stare at it across the window, and it really gave me pause and made me think about my relationship to empires that build up clock towers and the canopies inside all of us. So with that said, why haven't you been in a rehab centre for the past 4 years? Asked the first GP I went to in London, stunned as she realised how bad my pain really was after I'd come to her for painkillers, then come back to tell her the levels had not been significantly decreased. Relapse levels were 10 out of 10, and I had not had any way of preventing constant relapses. She immediately put me on the pain management program waiting list and gave me the largest possible dosage of gabapentin for neuropathic pain. I had been begging for a healthcare professional to understand better, to put me in a regular, proper course of treatment rather than sporadic help for 4 years. Help from the outside would continue to consist of medication from this point on, management of the day-to-day being my own responsibility. What the clock took was those 4 years and the 5 years after, where acute pain has been so frequent and so dismissed and minimized that my heart swirls with a constant hum of threat. These days, undergoing intensive hypnotherapy for CPTSD, I wake up, joke around with my fiancé, now husband, text gifts to friends, and work with the persistent anxiety that pain and disbelief of acute pain is around the corner or is already present. What built up Big Ben broke down my body-mind, and it was through rainforest trees. What I mean by that is that the Dutch East India Company, the world's first proto-megacorporation, one enacted by the Dutch kingdom, took a giant archipelago hostage and has never truly given it back, has opened it up to more and more theft. What I mean is that our rainforests were and are shipped to Europe, and our peoples were and are murdered, assaulted, exiled for resources from those forests, all those rainforests ground down to furniture in Amsterdam and burnt to the dirt to make way for palm oil plantations that spike our ramen, shampoo, and moisturizers. And among those peoples violated who remain inseparable from nature, and we'll get to that designation later, are Javanese cultures I come from, where we have disabled gods, and where once in the cool shade of the trees, disabled Javanese people were revered as spiritually important.
until Dutch missionary hospitals built with rainforest trees, institutions that introduced and violently enacted colonial ableism, a universalist medical model that ignored the uncultured masses with our indigenous genders and sexualities, with our ways of understanding healing, our own kings and kingdoms and our own power struggles, our own inequities, but never to this gargantuan scale, these genocidal centuries, these over 200 years of literal enslavement of peoples from the Indonesian archipelago, of slave adults, of slave children. This violence that disabled millions of villagers with guns pointed at us, their wood made from the rainforest trees. Guns placed these newly disabled in a world where this way of being was no longer widely held as sacred, but where the status quo was horrific. That was the 1600s, and this is today. And the rainforests are swallowed by palm oil plantations, trees planted in service of environmental destruction and climate change, which is why I balk at plant trees as a catch-all environmental phrase. These tree upheavals that created and create megacities, a breath away from bursting with consumerism, propped up with Jakarta's hundreds of malls. The trees taken from rainforests follow the center-periphery model European colonialism created. What is taken goes to a core that sucks the life out of all other worlds. I despise the word resources, the term natural resources. We do not see other living systems and creatures as things to be used. In my Minang culture from my mother's side, tigers are called iniak, the term for grandparent, as we believe our ancestors come back in their form. How could we see nature and culture as separate? There are over 700 remaining languages and cultures in the Indonesian archipelago that have survived brutal colonial capitalist heteropatriarchal ableism, countless genocides, and every genocide disabled communities, and every genocide cosmologies of connection hunted to shadows. As part of every genocide, the decimation of healing plants, of systems of healing, an erosion of respect for the wisdom of indigenous elders, a killing and evicting of the elders while the plants they worked with mourn in the sun and await their own demise. From an interview with Bayo Okomolafe in Deutsche Welle, quoted from an Emner Besse Phillips Poetry Society lecture, what we rudely call nature today does not even have a name in Yoruba culture because there was no distinction between us and the goings-on around us, Okomolafe says. The Yoruba religion of Ifa, he explains, sees a vitality in the non-human world. Mountains could be consulted, trees have privileges, yet, and the word Anthropocene does not mean to me what it seems to mean to most of the Western world. What indigenous communities around the world understand of Anthropocene is the following, written by indigenous scholars Zoe S. Todd and Heather Davis in The Importance of a Date, or Decolonizing the Anthropocene, themselves acknowledging that they take this from various indigenous communities around the world. The Anthropocene is not a new event, but is rather the continuation of practices of dispossession and genocide, coupled with a literal transformation of the environment that have been at work for the last 500 years. Further, the Anthropocene continues a logic of the universal, which is structured to sever the relations between mind, body, and land. Back to the essay, naturing in this way, this artificial mental separation between mind, body, and land, is part of the juggernaut of European and other colonial environmental destruction that led us to this moment. After enduring many mass murders of people trying to protect their profound connection to and stewarding of their lands, these connections inherently include indigenous disabled peoples' non-separation from nature. Indigenous peoples, like all other marginalized groups, are we who I prefer to call the majority world, contain within the much higher numbers of disabled people. And how could we not? When our rivers are poisoned with mine's mercury tailings, leading to the mass disablement of infants and adults, when our pathways for herbal healing are stripped off the face of the earth, and when our access to that which sustains us is barred from us by evicting us from lands, including lands later designated as national parks, when we do not know the soils of where medicine is taken from, when indigenous disabled people were very likely hurt and killed and certainly uncompensated in the process of pharmaceutical corporations' discovery and capture of tenderly held indigenous medicines. When indigenous peoples, once again, repeated and always, are the best caretakers of the planet and the best hope for environmental and climate salvation, we are that salvation. Yet the false separation of nature and people that colonialism continues to see fit for purposes is vilified, ridiculed, and dismissed by white and or colonial environmental organizers who think Western scientific management is always best, and there's only one way to define and see nature, that which is separate from us. The clocks imposed on an archipelago, the imperative to weekday and weekend and 9 to 5 and 12 solar month our existences, and the brutal ways in which they were instituted took from me so much disability justice infrastructure for my ancestral cultures. Cultures in which, instead of being violently assaulted on a sustained and regular basis by access fails and disbelief, I could have been cared for deeply, given healing plans I'm still only just learning the existence of. I could have been a different body mind. I do not want to be undisabled at this point. It has taught me too much, given me too much. What I want is not to suffer as a disabled person. This is possible. What prevents this is the gloved hand, the cloud of the rivers and the hospitals, and all the clocks of colonial ableism. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Okka, for the wonderful reading. It was it was wonderful to read that essay on a piece of writing on the page, and it's sort of even more wonderful, I think, to sort of hear you sort of read from it. So yeah, thank you. So the final reader tonight is Sally Huband, who lives in the Shetland Islands and is the author of Sea Being, which was longlisted for this year's Wainwright Prize. Her writing can also be found in Antlers of Water, an anthology which I'm sure is familiar to lots of you, of Scottish nature and landscape writing, which was edited by Kathleen Jamie. Her writings also appeared in Archipelago, a reader, edited by Nicholas Allen and Fiona Stafford. Sally is a recipient of a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award and holds a PhD in ecology and anthropology from the University of Edinburgh. And yeah, thanks again, Sally, for being here.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Okka, and Kat and Louise for all the brilliant readings, and a huge thank you to Louise for actually bringing this idea to reality. It's been such a positive experience working with an editor with whom you don't have to explain or excuse or justify, but who understands innately what it can mean to write about chronic illness. I wanted to say thank you to Cara Clark and Footnote 2 for their work on this book as well. I'm going to start with a visual description of myself, and I am a middle-aged white woman wearing big headphones and dark-rimmed glasses, and I've unintentionally twinned with Louise on the jumper front today, and I've got a dark black jumper on with pretty garish yellow zigzags. As Louise and David explained, I live in Shetland, which, if you're not familiar with it, is an archipelago of small islands 100 miles to the northeast of Scotland. I'm an incomer here, and if you want to read more about Shetland, I'd really recommend Roseanne Watt's collection, Modadi, which is bilingual in Shetland and English, and she's also a writer who understands the body very well and the body in connection to place. So Shetland is most often described in very romantic terms, but the truth of it is obviously more complex. It's a centre of energy extraction, but it's not a place in which the climate emergency is yet having a daily impact on lives. It's also a place of, I think, the highest fuel poverty in the UK. So it's most often described as remote, but if you live here, it is a centre. It's a place apart, but it's also incredibly connected, and even connected to what Okka was just talking about there too. In Sea Being, I sort of describe some of those connections that the sea that surrounds us here makes it impossible to ignore. It's both an easy and a difficult place to be chronically ill. So it is what we would perceive as a peaceful place, but it is also a place logistically where it's very difficult sometimes to get care, and a lot of our care takes place in the mainland of Scotland. So for routine scans, appointments, we have to fly south, and that takes quite a toll and obviously is very costly. So when Louise approached me, invited me to contribute, I felt so happy to be asked, because I just written a book called Sea Bean, and I did write my body into the book with intent, because it is frustrating that the nature writing genre and travel writing genre as a whole tends to be just from one perspective, as Louise described in the introduction, and which Polly so brilliantly summarizes in her book, Some of Us Just Fall. But I didn't actually go as far as I really wanted to, and I'm trying to unpick the reasons for that, why I was reluctant to really write in depth about pain. And so anyway, I didn't put it in the Sea Bean, but I'm really grateful for the home in Moving Mountains to do that. I'm going to read 3 passages, 2 a bit longer and 1 is a bit shorter, and I'm going to start with a passage called Wind, because today there is an easterly blowing. It's my least favourite wind direction. Wind. In her essay, The Pain Scale, Ulysses writes, wind, like pain, is difficult to capture. The poor windsock is always striving and always falling short. In medical terminology, exquisite pain describes pain that is extremely intense, sharp. The word exquisite has the meaning of precise in late Middle English and sought out in Latin. The east wind is a wind of stealth and always finds, with great accuracy, the places under my skin where pain hides. The west wind is not so cunning. It comes across the ocean in plain sight and uses blunt force to raise pain. I am wary of a northwesterly, the wind that brings Iceland gulls, an air so bitterly cold that my limbs look frozen. But the true north wind is generous, is an ice pack on a tender joint. I am fond of the true north wind, but despise the meticulousness of a northeasterly. I cower indoors and wait for the scalpel wind to pass. By the end of winter, I long for a southeasterly to carry warm air and migrant passerines to our islands. Most treasure wind of all is a gentle southerly of any kind, true east or west, on a sunny summer's day. I lie on the grass under the garden trees, and pain becomes airborne, drifts away with the willow down. Classification. The first time that a rheumatologist, a woman, asked me to describe the different kinds of pain that I encounter, I could not find the words, because 2 rheumatologists, both men, had already dismissed the symptoms of autoimmune disease to the point that I had begun to lose words. It took me a while to find them again. For example, a dead gannet lies on a beach, white feathers immaculate and gleaming. A metal fish hook has snagged on one of its wings. A length of nylon line dangles from the hook. Imagine one type of pane as a small and sharp metal hook embedded in a joint. Nylon line is also tied to this hook. Some days the line is slack, the hook is felt, but not so much. Other days the line is taut and there's no ignoring its sharp pull. On rare occasions the line is reeled in, rendering me immobile. This hook can never be removed. The pain of this hook can be dampened by an injection of steroids in a procedure that provokes its own unique glow of discomfort. Imagine another type of pain as reassuring, the comforting familiarity of a favorite tree. When this pain is present, everything is as it should be. This is in contrast to a cleaving pain which makes me think of an axe splitting wood along its grain, but slowly. Some pain has no edges, is as smooth as wave-tumbled sea glass. Some pain is sharp and sudden, a piece of broken glass hidden in the sand. Aftermath pain is deep and throbbing and fades to a faint persistence. And I think of this as infrasound generated by waves gliding in mid-ocean. Fatigue is salt spray on windows, and it is also the ha, the kind that weighs heavy as if silted with sediment, or the kind that is bright and buoyant, a clean sheet of paper, a blank space of possibility. Brittle star. I think of brittle stars, the fine and feathery-limbed relatives of starfish, as fragile. I only ever meet them dead on the shore. I handle their remains as gently as I can, but inevitably a limb or two will break away from the body at my touch. But my misconception of their fragility is based on my land dweller ignorance. When currents are strong enough to scour individuals away, brittle stars link arms and flatten their bodies to the seabed to reduce drag. When currents are not so strong, they still form mats, arms interlinked, because this allows each individual to raise more limbs to feed. I am grateful for friends with chronic illnesses, for the way in which we anchor ourselves to one another. And just another thank you to Louise and to Okka Cat and everyone else in this amazing anthology. It's going to anchor me from now on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally, for another wonderful reading. Yeah, thank you so much. I think Martin is now going to sort of pin on the screen sort of the various contributors tonight, so Louise, Sally, Okka, and Kat. And if anyone's got any, like I've said before, if anyone's got any questions, do please put them in the chat. We've got we've got a few minutes for questions. Like I said, we're going to probably end at about 2:45 rather than 8. And I just wondered, I said right at the beginning, I've got lots and lots of questions from reading the book, and then even more from listening to the readings tonight. But I just wondered whether I could just ask Louise, could begin by just asking you a question. And it's a question coming to you as sort of editor of the collection. And it's a question about form and ways of writing and the different forms that you've brought together in the collection. So I just wondered whether you could say a bit about that.
So seeing it all together, I mean, it's become much more than I could have ever imagined. When I started out, I gathered names of people, artists and writers whose work I loved and connected with and spoke to similar themes. So I commissioned the authors rather than particular pieces. I'd written a really long brief to kind of write myself into the project and to give a weigh in for the writers and then gave them all the freedom to interpret as broadly as they want. So I had no direction once it was left, once it kind of went out to being commissioned. And I think, I guess, partly my own background, because I come from an arts background and have come to writing more recently. I love that collection of different processes and different, so there's poetry, there's drawings, there's prose, there's essays, and there's a printmaker whose work, Dawn Cole, bookends the anthology at the start and the end. And I think it's really curious, the experience of illness being reflected back, not just through the words, but also in the way that the words are put together. So there's a real fluidity between the pieces and a really lovely conversation. I think one of the things that we do when we live with chronic illness or disability that goes disbelieved and is questioned every time, there's a cycle of storytelling, and our stories change every time. And Polly Atkin talks about this really well too, that each time we get a new bit of information in terms of diagnosis or blood test, our stories get a little bit more, they add something to the story, so we rewrite them. I'm rambling a little bit, so I don't know if that kind of answers a bit about what you wanted to know.
Definitely, and it gives a good sense, I think, about how the sort of the collection came into being. And I think just as a reader, I was just really sort of staggered by sort of the range of sort of forms really within the collection. On that question of form, I just wondered whether, Kat, I could ask you about sort of the relationship between form and sort of the body and place in your own work as it's sort of as it's published in the collection. And could you say a little bit more about that?
I can try. I think from essentially kind of having that very strange, and I think in some ways very familiar kind of feeling of being locked into one room. I think a lot of us who do have chronic illnesses and disabilities know what it's like to spend a long time in one place, to the extent that you then notice the very small and the very big essentially kind of taking place in the very small. So in the book, all of my work is kind of just connected by almost like long dashes, and I chose to try and punctuate it that way, unless I was kind of referencing somebody else's work, to kind of try and capture that sense of almost like sequence, kind of like the fluidity of just moving from one thing to another, just like almost as a series of noticings. And it became, that like kind of became the project of what would this allow me to hold together if there's no real distinction between a kind of a body or an environment or the institutions which hold us in place or fail to, and in terms of whether or not they fail to either provide care or access to care. So it kind of it became a very fluid thing, and I don't know necessarily whether or not I was kind of looking to either poetry or prose at this point. A lot of my work kind of takes from almost like new narrative, like queer writing from like the 70s and 80s in San Francisco, and sometimes like tries to apply it to disability, to think of, okay, if I inhabit bodily non-normalcy, then what does that do to a kind of textual comportment? Like, what does that do to genre, the kind of taxonomies that we like ascribe to writing? So if we kind of, are gender non-conforming, what would it mean to also be genre non-conforming? So it was kind of like this like fun play that I think poetry, as much as it kind of allows as a kind of disruption of those boundaries.
Definitely, and it's interesting you used the word sort of fluidity sort of a few moments ago, and some word that Louise used, and it was, as a reader sort of reading the collection, I was sort of so intrigued by both like the sort of fluidity of the writing, but also just the images of water that abound in the collection as well. There's so much water. Can I ask Okka a question? And it sort of ties in with something that Sally said at the end. Sally said that like she hopes that or she feels that there's this sort of this collection will help to anchor her. And I just wondered whether what you thought about that idea, about the importance of this collection as sort of like as a collection which might help to anchor people.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly helped to anchor me. Thank you again, Louise, for being so open to, as Kat just said, genre nonconformity, right? And saying, you know, like in whatever form you want to express your body and nature, express it. I really appreciated that. And I was saying to the other contributors and to you and Louise just before the event started that I feel like every single piece has moments where I go, oh my gosh, I recognize my own illness and my own body in other people's words. And I think that is, for me personally, I feel like it's making me more whole and like more, it's just showing me different facets through different mirrors and different lights. And very much a feeling of not being alone. In the essay, in a part that I didn't get to read about, but I talk about the loneliness of being a migrant here and the fact that I had to go through 3 weeks in hospital alone because I just didn't want to tell my friends, and I don't have family here, and how it's really hard, and you feel that you are alone, especially when you're disbelieved sometimes for years, as myself and many people are, and it's really hard to keep going. And I hope that this anthology will give ourselves, each other, you know, all the people in the anthology, like succor and grounding and anchoring in community. I think anchoring in a sense of not aloneness, I think, is so key, as well as other disabled and ill people. I'm so excited for them to read this and also feel not alone, because of, I think, the structures of society want that aloneness, right? They want us to think we're alone. They want disabled people to be isolated. I'm a migrant here on a global talent visa, and we are not allowed any access to public funds, which definitely caused me a lot of suffering over the past 8 years or so, because it's perceived if you're a writer and if you've accomplished certain things according to ableist standards, then you can't possibly be so ill that you need a carer, but many of us do. And I think not a lot of people are even aware of that. And I am grateful for this anchoring for all of us.
Thanks, Okka. And I was really interested in Sally, so it was just a specific question for you, really. And I just saw Kat then put in the chat, so that it does really feel like a community. And Sally, it was really interesting what you said. Maybe this is sort of my interest in place as well at the Centre for Place Writing, about the sort of idea of remoteness and the way that Shetland is often described as remote. And you said that, well, challenged that and said, well, it's the centre, isn't it, for people that live there. I just wonder whether you could just elaborate on that a bit more, because I thought that was really interesting.
That's a great question. I think Malachy Talek, Shetland writer, has written a lot about this, what he calls the faraway gaze. And I think there's a tension in resisting these imposed notions of remoteness with the actual practicality of living here. So, for example, there's no getting around the fact that we have to travel for a lot of basic medical care, and that traveling itself is problematic. So, the NHS here in Shetland have they pay for our flights or our ferry to the mainland of Scotland. The ferry is 12 hours long. So if you're already ill, this makes your illness a lot worse. So you can also choose to fly, but every few years there'll be a motion to remove people's right to fly, and you will have to go on the ferry. So I think these places are often seen through an able-bodied lens. And whilst it's also really important to reject imposed notions of places, at some point we have to talk about the practicalities of living in them too, and the challenges of delivering care, which often fails. So, for example, during the pandemic, there was a big influx of incomers. but at the same time, there was absolutely no rheumatology care for 2 years. So that's 2 years without any medical like support. So I think there's definitely a need to write against these. I'm trying not to reference the Kathleen Jamie piece on lone enraptured males too much, but we need these perspectives of people who are ill, disabled, because it completely transforms how you live in a place.
Very much, Sally. I never said we were going to end at 2:45, but Johnny's just asked a question in the chat. So if it's okay, I'll just ask that. And he said, a question for any of the contributors. Curious to know how you navigate or cultivate a regular creative writing practice whilst living with ongoing illness. For example, if certain symptoms affect your capacity. Can I maybe come back to Louise for that question?
Yeah, I suppose I don't is the short answer. I don't have a regular practice. It fluctuates and ebbs and flows as my body allows. It is a sanctuary and a saviour to me, as much as it can cause and aggravate pain and discomfort. So it's yeah, it's a case of small things sometimes, which might be text messages to myself or post-it notes, as much as it might be a kind of longer duration of sitting and writing.
Any of the other contributors want to say anything in response to Johnny's question? Sally, yeah.
Well, my answer honestly is that I have written 2,000 words this whole year. So and I would echo what Louise says. So for me, like, if I'm writing, that part of my brain does, I'm lucky, it's the kind of pain that can be diminished when you're focused on something. So without writing, it's kind of like a trap. Writing is integral to working through it, but often the fatigue will it's just too much. So it is really sporadic. And I think I'm thinking of Abby Palmer's book Sanatorium, and also what Polly says in about always being in a position of starting again or not knowing where you are.
Yeah, and I just kind of put in the chat that, you know, irregularity is where it's at rather than forced regularity. I think that like a lot of, I mean, don't we all hate those writing tips from famous authors like wake up at 5 a.m., jog 5 miles, write 5,000 books. And it's like, who does that? Who can do that? You know, I don't think they're being honest, for one, but also like it's not practical for so many of us. And the way I do anything, honestly, is with reminders from loved ones to stop all the time. My long-suffering husband has constantly just like will tell me to shut down my laptop, to not do anything but lie down, because I want to create and I want to make, and then that will cause a relapse for 5 days. You know, and you're so used to like pushing through it. I think especially when you're isolated and alone and you don't have those people around you, and it's easy to get into that mode. So again, with brittle stars holding hands, you know, like we have to remind each other it's okay to stop. Don't worry about clocks, don't worry about productivity or measures of what is quote unquote success, and just, you know, which is difficult when we all, I mean, I think this anthology is a success, right? But I think it needs to be recognized that this is a success achieved through so many individual timescales and timelines. Like this is the kind of success that is done slowly and with patience, and I think that needs to be a distinction that we recognize and appreciate.
I think it's wonderful to see this kind of accomplished in crypt time. like that absolute kind of flex time that doesn't necessarily adhere to able-bodied and kind of capitalist notions of productivity. Like this was accomplished with us, with our disabilities, as opposed to either overcoming them in the kind of super crypt narrative way that we all absolutely wish would jump in the bin. So again, thank you. I mean, to echo everything that you have said, I do not have a regular creative writing practice. I do what my bodies allow, and like exactly the same. Like my partner comes in and is like, you are taking a weekend. I'm like, especially working in the institution where it's like the kind of work-life balance kind of doesn't really happen, where like my work is my life and my life is also kind of like a part of my creative work. So having that distinction somehow, trying to like almost like orbit my kind of functioning around like, oh no, in order to have a practice I need to actually rest. And so seeing this happen, like seeing the anthology coming together and even just being here is something that I'm really grateful for. And the fact that we've all kind of come together with our like very much at this point I think dysregulated and also like non-able-bodied selves, and to be able to be those bristle stars holding hands for each other for first and foremost rather than an able-bodied audience, I think is also really important. And I'm unbelievably thankful. And again, like it's been a wonderful event to see all of you. So again, thank you.
It's also been, just to chip in at the end there as well, we've ended up with everybody that we started with, and I'm just so thrilled that nobody got lost along the way, and we ended up actually with more people because I started to panic, or Footnote started to panic that a couple of things wouldn't get in on time, and everybody got in, which just astonishing. So it's amazing what can be done when there is flexibility and when there's the scope, because I think it's so much richer, absolutely much richer to have so many, all of you included. I'd hate to have not had anybody because we had a deadline that somebody couldn't have got to. So no, it's amazing.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for responding to Johnny's question. Thanks, Johnny, for the question in the chat. So I think we'll sort of draw it to a close there. I just want to end with sort of a few thank yous, really. I really want to say thank you to Martin, who's been working sort of behind the scenes. Martin from the Poetry Library, working behind the scenes, and has dealt with the sort of technical problems as well, and has sort of fielded questions and has been texting me throughout. So thank you, Martin, for keeping all that going. And please do keep an eye on the Poetry Library's website, and including events that they hold. And they've got including the launch of Modern Poetry Translation, which will take place on the 9th of November. I'd also like to thank the publishers, Footnote Press, for their support, and for personally for sending me a proof copy of the book. So I had the pleasure of reading it, so thank you. And if you haven't already done so, as you sort of know from tonight, I sort of urge you to sort of go out and buy copies as soon as you can, because as Louise writes in her introduction, I wrote this down, a kaleidoscope sits within these pages. This anthology offers a rich world of wild experience. Each contribution is filled with wisdom and vulnerability, insights and fears, losses and treasures. And I think, it was a sort of a few sentences which sums up my experience of reading the book. I also want to thank everyone for logging in, and especially those for patiently waiting and then logged in later. As I said halfway through this and at the beginning, this event has been recorded, so we will make it available online via Manchester Met's website. So you'll be able to sort of pick up on what you might have missed. Final sort of penultimate thing I was going to say, remind you about the event at Sam Reed tomorrow. I just saw Polly pop up on the screen, so that's reminded me that event's tomorrow night. And finally, I'd like to thank all of the speakers, all of the writers who've contributed tonight. So thank you very much for giving up your time. Thank you very much for the readings, which were just incredible. So thank you, Louise, Kat, Okka, and Sally. And I'd be grateful if everyone else could sort of join me in sort of a virtual clap for everyone who's been here, who's read tonight. Okay, so thank you all very much for logging in, and go buy the book. Okay, bye everyone.